All right, so before we get started, since Alan decided to call it out, they're more than you think, because they're actually Star Trek socks. So those of you who are paying attention will notice there's usually interesting socks. I just guess nobody's been paying attention before. All right.
Those are really, really nice.
Well, yeah, good save, Alan. All right. So this morning's scripture is one that perhaps we've run into a time or two, but it comes with a couple of challenges for us today, as sometimes scripture does, because again, we don't live in the first century at the time Jesus was offering these words up. We have a tendency, anytime we see anybody in the Bible, especially anybody in Jesus' stories, whoever, who is called a king or a lord, to just automatically assume that those people are there to be stand-ins from God. That is sometimes the case, and sometimes not. And there's always a little bit of a judgment call you have to make about whether Jesus actually means this person, it is clearly an actual person in the story, to be a king or a lord in their own right, or one that is there to actually as a stand-in for God. My contention, the contention of many, is that this one is the former and not the latter. Because while when we think of something in the Bible, when we think of kings and lords and all that sort of stuff, we automatically think of God because that's the king and the Lord that we know. In Jesus' time in the first century was awash with all kinds of kings and lords, and most of them were not very good. So this is offered up, as often happens in the Bible, as an example of a very earthly and human Lord and King that is acting in a pretty earthly and human way. And I believe that's first and foremost how we are supposed to treat it. Now, in this time, there were actually all sorts of lords running around, all sorts of kings running around. Jerusalem is within the Roman Empire, but it is also the easternmost edge of it. There's a lot of unclaimed independent territory around it, and even within the empire itself, there are all sorts of little regional lords and people who, have control over a given piece of land and, people within it and all those sorts of things. So the fact that there would be these sort of regional rulers all around that most people would be subject to in one way or another was not uncommon, and in fact, it's how most people lived. So Jesus offers up a story to us about this idea of forgiveness. Now, we've got this king, and this king or this lord definitely rules over this, probably a territory and a group of people, and he has people who works for him. And so there are going to be people who work for him that this slave or servant that we introduced to is clearly one, and is not only one, but obviously a very, very senior one. 10,000 talents is a lot of money. 1 talent would be the equivalent about 15 years earnings for the average person. So do the math on what 10,000 talents must be. It is not likely that this person actually rang up that sort of debt themselves, right? It's not likely that they necessarily are going home to some palatial palace, with whatever the first century equivalent of a Rolls Royce in the driveway is. What is more likely the scenario here, because again, this is just how the world worked at the time, is those senior level servants had a required tribute that they were to collect and offer back to their lord. And that tribute that they would be responsible for would then they would farm out to the people underneath them, and those people would be taxed or tasked with tax and extracting their quota that would then get paid up to the servant, that would then get paid up to the king. And obviously this servant is a bit behind in his collections to a great deal. If this is starting to sound like the plot of the Godfather movie, you're not far off. That's how it worked, right? In fact, you will find this same system used pretty much throughout the world in different cultures and different times. This seems to be a way of being that humans seem to gravitate to. So when the servant goes and he basically fails to do his job, fails to collect the money he is meant to collect, he knows he's in trouble. And if you learned anything from, the Godfather movies, is you don't want to make the guy at the top mad. Well, he did. And so he fully expected the punishment that he was going to receive, and he knew the only thing that he could do is fall down on his face, basically humiliate himself in front of him, make sure everybody knows that this servant knows that the king is still in charge and the king's the important one, and ask for mercy and forgiveness. He's probably not expecting it, but he gets it anyway. And if the story ended there, we may go, oh, this is a story that we are supposed to forgive, even forgive big things. But of course, the story doesn't end there. It keeps going because the slave doesn't do the smart thing, which is just go home and keep his mouth shut. Instead, he walks out and he runs into somebody else, basically somebody under him who owed him some money and tries to get it from him. Now, it's both, both very frankly dumb, but also a little bit understandable. Had it been the day before, anything that servant had collected would have had to immediately go up to help pay the debt that he owed to the king. Now that he didn't owe anything, when he collected the money from those under him, sure, most of it's still going to go up to the king, but now part of it can go in his own pocket because that's how the system works. That's how he gets paid. He gets to take a little and give the rest. Well, if you owe as much as he owes, you don't get to take a little, and now he does. So suddenly, everybody paying him is much more important because that's real for him now in a way that it probably wasn't before. And then finally, of course, the king finds out, and the problem with the king has in all of this is the king cannot look weak. And if the king forgives somebody's debts and then sees them go and do this, then he's concerned that his concern will definitely be that that's going to make me look weak, and other people may think they can take advantage of me. And really, the whole way the system works is if people very much understand that they cannot do that. And so, of course, the punishment that was always going to be his punishment in the beginning comes down on him at the end. The king has a book. Somewhere there is a ledger that has written in it everything that he believes everybody owes him. And this servant has his own book. And in that book is a ledger, and in it is everything that he believes everybody owes him. Now, I don't know, and admittedly I don't know all of you, but I don't believe that we have very many people here who live in a sort of like mafia-esque, lifestyle. If you do, maybe we should talk about your tithe, if nothing else. We don't really live in a world like this as much, though anyone who's ever gotten behind on a car payment or a credit card payment or those sorts of things knows, how tenacious some of those people can be, and that sometimes you can encounter people who have grace and sometimes you can encounter people who don't. Right? But that tends to be off in that world now. And we mostly live in another kind of world where we live kind of separate from all of this. But that does not mean that we are not capable of finding, collecting, and holding on to debts and things that we believe people owe us. And that really, at the end of the day, is what Jesus is talking about here. He's using this very clearly as a metaphor, not just for monetary debts that people may owe us, but the way that we have a tendency to hold on to times and situations and places when we believe maybe somebody did us wrong, or somebody didn't do the thing we think they should have done, or they did the thing that we think they shouldn't have done. We have a tendency as people to sort of file that away. Now maybe, hopefully, you're not writing all that down in a book. I'm going to suggest you stop if you are. But we also have this amazing mind that God has given us that has this very weird ability to hold on to random things, including the things we probably prefer it not. And one of the things that it tends to be able to hold on to, unfortunately well, are those times and places where we believe somebody either did or didn't do something we wished they hadn't or did do. Yes. And then we have to decide what we're going to do about it. Over time, sometimes those things just fade, but oftentimes there does come a moment where you have to actually make a conscious choice. Am I going to continue to let this thing bother me? Am I going to continue to hold on to this debt in my head, or am I going to let it go? And of course, there are problems if we hold on to it too long. One example that I came across several years ago that was both amusing and very, very sad was a story of two families that lived right next to each other in Munich, Germany. They were the Kern and Birch families. And somewhere about 14 years prior to when this article that I read probably 10 years ago was written, one of the families planted an elderberry bush a little too close to the fence for the other family's liking. And the other family took exception to it. And the first family said, "Too bad, I'm not taking it out." And in response, the other family basically started to do things like reconstruct the fence so it was now 12 feet high. And that made the other family obviously upset. And also, what good is a fence if you can't see what's going on? So the other family actually then decided to install security cameras on their side of the fence. And this is like 1995. It's not like you went down and bought a Ring doorbell, right? A lot more work, to do that. They decided to go install security cameras on their side of the fence, and so they could see what's going on over there, and they reported multiple disturbances of the peace and trespassing claims and all this sort of stuff. After a while, there was a claim from the other family that they had intentionally sowed grass and weed seeds in their garden. I mean, we're like germ warfare at this point, and it literally went back and forth and back and forth for years. There were incidences where one of the families at the middle of the morning, very late at night or early in the morning, would crank the music up to like 12, right? And aim the speakers at the other house, right? This is Munich, not Guantanamo. And it went back and forth and back and forth. And of course, the thing that actually made this an even bigger problem for these families is that these two families were not only neighbors, but the home they shared was actually a duplex. They literally had walls with one another, and failed to put a roof replacement on for years that they desperately needed because they couldn't agree who was going to pay how much. Obviously, you look at this story, and it is a little bit amusing. But you also wonder not only about these two, but what it must have been like for all of the neighbors in this very kind of small, tight-knit community all around them. And what all of those neighbors must have thought of those two neighbors in the middle. My guess is they didn't think very highly. My guess is they didn't consider them good neighbors. And in fact, quite the opposite. Those two families were living in a world where no doubt they literally had a book and were writing down all the grievances and slights they could possibly think of. And that book and writing those things down had become one of the most important things to them. And because it had become that important, it was something that they couldn't get rid of. This is the problem when we hold on to things like this. They become burdens to us, but they become burdens to us that over time actually get harder and harder to get rid of. Because the more that we have invested our time and energy and effort into remembering and maintaining and increasing the perceived debt, the more that we have invested our time and energy of that, the harder and harder it is to walk away. Because if we do, we have to admit to ourselves that all of that time we spent remembering and reinforcing that debt was not time well spent. And so it gets harder and harder the longer we go on to let things go. Keeping debts like that really only has one purpose. And the purpose is to arm yourself. The purpose is to have something to throw when somebody throws something at you. We watch kids do this all the time. How many times have you been around a kid? They're like, well, you broke my toy. Well, you killed my goldfish. Well, Kids have an amazing memory for this sort of stuff. And hopefully, as good parents, one of our jobs is to tell them, hey, maybe you need to let some of this go and teach them how to do it. Because when you live in that world, when you choose to live in that world of back and forth, when you choose to continue to invest more and more into it, no doubt, the more and more that takes up more and more space in your life. And I wouldn't doubt that neither of those families was very popular with the people around them. On a day-to-day basis, maybe that's okay. But there will come a time when it's not. Jesus is saying there's another way to live. We have another opportunity to live. We have another way to live where we don't actually write those things down, where we don't build up that list of debts in the first place, and we choose to see our neighbors differently. Not as people who may owe us something, but as people worthy and in need of love. Recently in our church, we had an opportunity to practice this in an interesting way. And since the Knowltons aren't here, I can talk about them. So as many of you know, the Knowltons had a very catastrophic flood in their basement a few weeks ago. And of course, Restoration Company came out and did all the things that they need to do, but their basement was used. 2 of their girls lived down there. Mike's office was down there. All sorts of things were down there. And so in order for the Restoration Company to do what they needed to do, everything else needed to come out. Well, the Restoration Company does some things, but one thing they don't do is they don't move furniture. Or they'll move furniture to one side of the room and work on it and then move it to the other side of the room. But if you want it moved out, especially up a flight of stairs from a basement, they don't do that, FYI. And so Becca and I were talking, and she's like, yeah, we got to get this furniture out. We've got a couple of friends we think are able to come help us this day at 5 o'clock. This was 3 o'clock in the afternoon on that day. I said, what time are you doing it? I said, 5 o'clock. I said, okay. I, at that time, was in no business to help and probably wouldn't be a lot of help. That's not me. I'll feed you, right? And I did. They fed us for a while, and we fed them for a while. But I'm like, I bet you there are some people who would. So I got into our handy church management system, because we have a fancy system, and I found a group of people that I thought was probably the right group of people to help. And at 3:30 in the afternoon, I said, if you want to help the Knowltons move furniture, be there at 5 o'clock. They need to get all the stuff out of the basement. They were expecting maybe 2 people to come help. Instead, 8 people showed up, including people much better equipped to do that work than me. When it was over and all done, the Restoration Company came to them and said, we have never seen that many people come and help somebody in this way on that short of notice. Not even close. And Rebecca was very touched and kind of overwhelmed by it. My reaction was a little bit different. My reaction is, how sad. How sad that there are that most people apparently live in a world and live in a life where they can't pull together a handful of people on a moment's notice to help them literally deal with a tragedy that's unfolding in front of them. When we talk about the value of community, but not just the value of community, but value of community that comes together for a purpose, I think these is one of those things that we see. And since we are a community that comes together for a purpose, and our purpose is to love God, love neighbor, and love ourselves, then we can really only be that community when we choose to live that out. So my response was to be sad for everybody else and think, I hope someday they can find a place that is able to do these same things. One of the people who was there, who did help, who shall remain nameless, came to me later and asked, how many people did you send that text to? And I said, not very many, just this little group. And he said, okay, good, because I was going to be mad that that's all the people who showed up. He was expecting more. We choose to live in a different world, in a different place, with a different set of expectations. That's what Jesus is calling us to do. That is how Jesus is calling us to live. To be in a place where we're not sitting down wondering, now wait a minute, the Knowltons borrowed that thing from me that one time and they never returned it, so I'm not going to go help them. Nobody thought that. And if you did, shame on you. I don't usually call people wrong, but you're wrong. No. We are called to live in that different world, in that different place. We are called to live a different life with different priorities, where we do not waste our time and energy counting who owes us things, but instead we spend our time and energy looking for those opportunities that we have to bless ourselves and bless others. Because here's the thing. That king, that Lord, has a book, and he wrote stuff down in it. His servant had a book, and he wrote stuff down in it. We talk in this church all the time because what else can we talk about but Jesus and the fact that Jesus forgives us? And that fact Jesus forgives us before we even know we need forgiveness. And even if we don't think we deserve it, because we probably don't, in fact, we know we don't, that forgiveness is there for us anyway. There's a hidden truth in this and in Jesus that I think sometimes we need to remind ourselves of. And one of the places that we can find that is in Psalm 130. And Psalm 130 says, if you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, Lord, who could stand? But there is forgiveness with you, so that you may be revered. If you, O Lord, should mark iniquities. Jesus didn't come to cross out all of the stuff under our names in the book. Jesus came to tell us and remind us and make sure we know there is no book in the first place. God is not keeping score in that way. God is not writing down a list of all of the places that we messed up and making sure that we say the Lord's Prayer enough time to cover it. That's not how it works. And in fact, it can't work that way. It can only work the way that it does, which is Jesus already came and already took care of things that wouldn't happen for decades, centuries, and millennia later. And the only way that that works is if there's no book to begin with. This king is not an allegory for God, because this king has a book and our God does not. So it is not that we need to worry about crossing things off some list or some scorecard that we think God is keeping on us. The task is to recognize that there was no book in the first place, to celebrate that fact, and then not do what the slave did, but instead recognize that the only response we can have to God not having a book is to not have one ourselves. That does not mean that we let abusive people continue to abuse us. It does not mean we do not protect ourselves. It does not mean that we let bad people do bad things if we can stop it. It does not mean any of that. What it does mean is we pray for those who persecute us. We love our enemies even though they don't deserve it. And we don't hold a book of grudges and instead look for an opportunity to add to the book of blessings. That's what Jesus did. That's what God did. And that's what we are called to do together. Amen.